What did your dissertation focus on specifically?
So the title is kind of long and verbose, as they are likely to be. It was called In Good Faith, Wikipedia Collaboration and the Pursuit of the Universal Encyclopedia. So to unpack that a bit, basically I'm interested in Wikipedia collaboration, in particular the cultural norms that facilitate collaboration. But I wanted to frame it in a historical context. So I actually argue that Wikipedia, in trying to come up with a thing like Wikipedia, a universal encyclopedia, has been a long-pursued vision for at least 100 years, which is where I restrain my focus to.
Right. Wow. So 100. So we're like going back 100 years. Where would that Where would you be? Where would it be in terms of like collaborative communities? What was going on like 100 years ago?
Well, in terms of what people wanted, you probably haven't heard of Paul Otlet, who was a Belgian documentalist, but you probably have heard of H.G. Wells.
Yeah.
And he was quite the visionary. And
Time traveler, right?
Right.
Yeah.
He had an idea for what he called a world encyclopedia.
Cool.
And he was quite concerned with the changes that were happening across the world, including the potential for discord and global war. And he thought with the advances of technology at his time, which is actually interesting enough, was microfilm, loose leaf binders, and index cards, somehow society, the global world, would be able to create an encyclopedia that not only would be useful and available to any student with a microfilm reader, but actually would bring about world peace to some extent. Because there was a presumption if you know other people, you're going to get along with them better.
Right. Wow. Very.
And so a lot of the interest in Wikipedia has been about to what extent it is really open. Because it has this byline, it's known as Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia that anyone can edit. And that question is a very provocative one. Is there really something anyone can edit? And as a collaborative community, as an open collaborative community, that has certain benefits and demerits. Benefits are anyone can come and contribute something. The demerits are that anyone can include antisocial people who want to do nothing more than push their point of view or bias, right, or just be disruptive, boneheads. Right. And so somehow you need to create some sort of mechanism where you take advantage of the open collaboration but limit the disruption from the same openness. Right. And so there's this question, is Wikipedia open? And that's been one of the subjects of my research and interest. And the Afghan story was, and actually there was another case of this just a couple of weeks ago, there was another Afghan reporter. The Wikipedia angle didn't make it into the press, but again they had suppressed information. Mm-hmm. Because in these cases it was believed by the New York Times that reporting that these journalists had been kidnapped would further endanger them.
Right.
And so they were able to go to other news organizations, including Al Jazeera, which was interesting to me, to say, please don't cover this.
Wow. And
they also asked Wikipedia not to put that information in there. But of course, with Wikipedia, everything is open, and someone was trying to add this information. Right. And he wasn't identifiable, so they couldn't say to him privately, look, we want to keep this on the down low right now. Right. And so one of the policies of Wikipedia is any claim you include on Wikipedia that isn't common knowledge should be verifiable and needs a source. Right. And so they were able to repulse his contribution by saying, you don't have a really good source, and then lock the page for the time being. Wow. And so that made a lot of people say, oh my gosh, look, Wikipedia isn't as open as it used to be.
And why do you think Wikipedia chose to take it down? Because they got pressured by...
I think the people who were at the Wikipedia, along with the English Wikipedia, along with many other Wikipedias, and other projects like Commons and Wikidictionary and Wikinews, they're all under a charter nonprofit called the Wikimedia Foundation. Right. And so if you have a legal concern, there's an office that you can contact. And I think the people at the foundation and who were at the office were concerned that this might contribute to this person's death or injury, and so this was the right thing to do morally.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
And then the second case was one of the most contentious areas on Wikipedia is they call it BLP. Mm-hmm. And that's the biography of living persons. And so very often a lot of the vandalism happens there. Mm-hmm. Some of it is defamatory, some of it is pranks, some of it is testing. Right. But Wikipedia is grappling with how to best remain as open as possible while limiting that sort of disruptive editing. Right. And one of the ways they do that now is through these mechanisms they call protection, which locks it from editing by anyone except an administrator, wow, or semi-protection, which locks it to anyone who hasn't been a Wikipedian for like about a week, I think it's like 4 days, which isn't all that big of a constraint. It just means you have to have logged in, created a pseudonym, and not done anything stupid for 4 days.
Right.
And it's a fraction, like people say, oh my gosh, when semi-protection was introduced, people were afraid Wikipedia was closing down and wasn't open anymore.
Right.
But it's like 0.01 something percent of Wikipedia content.
Right.
And the biographies are 16% of Wikipedia content. But they do get a lot of attention. So this new mechanism called flag revision, or that's the feature, allows people to flag or bookmark a particular revision of an article, because it's a wiki and everything has a history and you can step back through all the different versions. It allows you to sort of bookmark one of those versions and vet it and say, this version's pretty good.
Right.
And then you could use that for, they call it flag patrolling, to say, well, I want to see if there any spam has been introduced on this page. You can do the difference against the last vetted version.
Wow.
On really controversial or contentious pages, they're talking about particularly a subset of the biographies of if you're a public member and not a Wikipedian, you haven't logged in,
Right.
you see the last vetted version.
Right.
So the idea, the ethos that anyone can edit would still be the same, but for a subset of the pages, not everyone is going to immediately see your edit.
Right. Very.
The former president of the American Library Association, Michael Gorman, says that professors who use or allow students to use Wikipedia is like feeding them a diet of Big Macs. Right? But nonetheless, I do use Wikipedia in my classes. Sometimes in my bibliography or resources, I'll have particularly dated versions of articles that I have vetted.
Cool.
And so I allow my students to use those versions. Not the most recent version, because somebody could have put something in there that I didn't think was appropriate. And in terms of students using other pages, I say we all use Wikipedia. There's no denying it, in my opinion.
Yep.
And as in any other reference work, it's appropriate to use as a start of your research, but not the end of your research.
Right.
So I say, you can certainly welcome to cite Wikipedia, but it's not authoritative.
Right.
Like, you don't have to pretend that you never used it. So I counsel the students to, they can cite the Wikipedia, but then cite one of the sources that it's making use of, and make sure that they read it and check it, because that's what it says. Very often, sometimes you'll find on Wikipedia that there's a source for something, and you can find this in other scholarship just as well. You'll go read that footnote, and you're like, that's not what they're saying. So it's an important exercise, and actually, to that extent, Wikipedia is a teaching moment, particularly for a department like ours, which is about media, and to some extent, media literacy.
Yeah.
This allows us to understand the social construction, socially constructed character of knowledge, and hopefully gives us an opportunity to actually engage with it and be skeptical about what we see in the media.